Well, the weather outside is frightful, but new episodes are delightful. And since we've got new content, here we go. For the last time in 2024, hello, honeys, and welcome to your full-length episode. Technically a special, but for all intents and purposes, a full length. In honor of the holiday spirit, and also because we've hit the point of the year where TV Christmas specials and movie marathons abound and provide plenty of inspiration to yours truly, we're going to go with a film history topic today. So today, honeys, we'll be talking through the origin stories of some of your favorite Christmas time specials. We'll cover the man behind the most famous reindeer of all, as well as how Charlie Brown Christmas came to be so very different from other specials. And finally, how the Grinch stole Christmas and all of our hearts. With no further ado, let's get started. As I was trimming trees and otherwise participating in the festivities this year, honeys, I came to realize just how many Christmas specials and movie marathons there are and how many different ages of film are represented in them. And besides, we all know what I'm talking about when I mention these holiday specials, the recognizable elements like themes of love, hope, and redemption, the memorable characters, the Christmas time settings, magical components, and often that these have just such a universal appeal. They're also just such a sure thing. Year after year, these classic and popular wintertime movies, specials, play and or stream, and new ones continue to be made, and we find all that comforting. So our goal here today, honeys, is to break down not only the commercialism and the marketing logic behind these stories, but to really understand the heartwarming nature, the comfort aspect as well. Looking at both will help us understand our connection to these films and shows, and will also let us take a look at the social history of TV. And I'd like to start here actually with a hot take. Today's sources have officially convinced me that Christmas movies should be considered a sub-genre, not a genre. And they convinced me by showing me how the Christmas aspect is a layer to the existing genre. For example, Krampus of 2015, decidedly a horror movie. It just so happens to have very recognizable Christmas elements. Kind of the same deal with Holiday from 2006. Clearly a rom-com, although there's a Christmas time twist. And this one really might piss you off, honeys, but Die Hard, 1988, it's an action and a Christmas movie, partially because the co-writer of it has officially said so. So with that clarification / mini argument out of the way, I hope you can understand why I've decided we must limit our scope to animation today. There are simply way too many and way too different of live actions to try this sort of episode with. And let's face it, Hallmarks would be too boring, formulaic, and don't even have the literal art we're looking for here. So there are reasons, especially for those, to be left out. However, there is an episode of Sounds Like a Cult on the Hallmark movies. If that's your thing, more than happy to make your recommendation there. So, animation. Of course, it just so happens to be that stop motion and animation sit in like the smack middle of the Christmas movie history timeline. So we'll give a brief, bigger picture overview just for some context, just so you understand where we're coming from, where we're going. The 1930s to the 1950s saw almost exclusively holiday movies, and they were part of the Hollywood Golden Age, featuring the day's biggest stars in holiday set films made for adults. Think Miracle on 34th Street as well as It's a Wonderful Life. Slightly later in this period, further towards the 50s, is when we see the evolution towards festive classics with lots of dancing, for example, White Christmas. Yet the 1960s see things start to change. As more and more American households bring in televisions, there's a shift to TV airing instead of the typical cinema movie house formats of the past. This means that those creating films and movies are much more concerned with how to get them on TV, and that brings up the rise of what's called the window. The window is a means of film distribution that comes further into play as these big studio executives decide that the films of the 1960s and 70s would debut in theater, but then later be aired on TV. This sort of double premiere, the chance to make money off of both formats, was a totally new idea, and it was based on survival. The studios were facing huge profit losses as American families switched to watching TV every night instead of going out to films once or twice a week. So everyone on the film side of things, networks, etc., decide they want to keep up with this new watching reality and determine that TV needs its own holiday time programming, which then and now largely resulted in holiday variety specials. And this strategy worked perfectly. Changing to the window format allowed the studios two bigger chances to make money. In a fascinating twist, however, one of the biggest beneficiaries of the window method was actually a Golden Age film. It's a Wonderful Life had not done well in the box office originally, but became a ratings hit when it began showing annually on numerous TV networks after it fell out of copyright in 1974. Many of our sources believe that the film would have fallen into obscurity had it not had this opportunity to benefit from the window method. The 1960s and 70s also saw growing recognition of the opportunities for animated Christmas movies released in season, especially potential financial benefits. So studios and networks went out of their way to launch them to popularity because it was good business. The successes of these efforts are attributed to the relatively lower cost of animation and how strongly it appealed to younger audiences. And that means that it achieved its goals, because animated specials had two purposes at this time. First, appeal to children, who in the 1960s didn't have really any other channels to watch, in hopes of getting them to influence family viewing and thus buying decisions. The second purpose is that the program was allowed inherently in this format to be limited in scope, usually under 30 minutes long and of a budget, as I said, usually cheaper to do animated, which means there were less financial resources needed to make something that ended up on essentially free-to-viewers TV. And for studios, that made a lot of sense. And when we have concluded our timeline, these are the examples we'll be coming back to. The ones from the 60s like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, A Charlie Brown Christmas, and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, as well as examples from the 70s with Santa Claus is Coming to Town and The Year Without Santa Claus. But to wrap up our chronology here, the 1980s pushed the boundaries of what a Christmas movie could be by definition, by trope, by genres. Here, look to Die Hard, Gremlins, and/or Scrooged. The 90s focused on Christmas movies for the whole family, though, with the Home Alone series and the Santa Claus debuting. The 2000s, however, were dominated by Christmas romance and comedy, with examples including Elf, Polar Express, and Love Actually. So what caused this sharp change away from the animation style that was so popular just a decade before? The 1980s Christmas movies switched moods as a reflection of the real-life high-stakes political and cultural climates of the U.S., especially its distrust and fears of foreign cultures, often through extravagant violence and explosions. Such tropes and plot lines brought the category of Christmas films into the new genres of action and horror for the first time. Another reason for the changing moods, tones, and categories is the changing technology. Home entertainment took over the scene from the 80s to the 2000s as first the VHS, then the DVD boom allowed more films to be made by Hollywood, often at higher budgets than in the past. One of our sources says, quote, at their peak in just the United States, DVD sales were $16.3 billion, of which the U.S. collected a big chunk. Now, physical discs like DVD and Blu-ray are only a $2.2 US billion business. This meant that theatrical films roughly made $6 billion more dollars for their studios in the US than they do now. All that extra cash allowed smaller films to compete for smaller niches of customers, end quote. With the decline of these sales, studios often turned back to blockbuster preferences as well as a new format, cable. So why the cable emphasis after DVD and VHS? Well, by the 2000s, almost everyone was connected to cable in the ground, and these antennas of the past were obsolete. The transition to cable is important because TV cables are not restricted by spectrum space, meaning the number of channels could skyrocket into the hundreds from the 10 max of antennas past. For some years, this didn't have much effect on the production of Christmas specials and/or movies, only how they aired, because almost no channel could afford even a $20 million budget film. But then Lifetime and Hallmark figured out they could make more movies on the lowest level budgets, film them quickly, and still have some success. And you know what happened next. Right, our sources quote, at about 1.5 to 2.5 million per film and shot in 3 weeks. In other words, you could make 5 to 10 of these movies for one episode of The Mandalorian. They also tend to be shorter than regular movies, again to limit costs and because the cable channels sell advertising in the breaks, end quote. So cable really gave way to the rise of these cheap, quick romance holiday films because they were an opportunity to potentially make a little more money. And with few exception, that's how we've continued into the streaming era with these lesser budget rom-coms seen on the Hallmark Channel, as well as the occasional different sort of made for streaming release like The Rock's newest Christmas movie. So let's get back to the good stuff, shall we? Get back to our famed faves, our examples of animation for today. We begin, of course, with the most famous reindeer of all. All of the animations started with the song itself, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It was written by Johnny Marks and recorded 75 years ago by the country music singer and movie star Gene Autry. As we know, it was a huge commercial success when released in the last week of December 1949, becoming Billboard's best-selling pop single and children's record, and the 4th best-selling country and western record. Writes the New York Times, quote, by 1985, when Marks died at 75, there reportedly were some 500 versions that tallied 150 million records sold. Marks had sold as many as 8 million copies of the sheet music and 25 million copies of orchestral and choral arrangements, end quote. So where did the idea for Rudolph the song come from? Actually, partially Marks's personal and familial connections to the short story. Johnny Marks was a captain in addition to being a part-time entertainer for troops during his decorated 4-year service in the Army. And after World War II, he married a woman by the name of Margaret. Margaret's brother, Robert L. May, was a copywriter for the Montgomery Ward department store chain in Chicago. The retailer had been buying and giving away booklets for Christmas every year and decided that creating their own book would save money at one point, so they tasked May with the job shortly after his sister's wedding. Here's where things get interesting. According to Time magazine, the Rudolph story was partly based on some of Robert May's past experiences as someone who, growing up, was a, quote, shy and small boy, end quote, and who, quote, had known what it was like to be an underdog, end quote. May had always liked the idea of an ugly duckling parallel character, aka one, quote, shunned by others but vindicated some way in a happy ending, end quote. But the Rudolph we know and love was almost a very different story. It originally had a much sadder tone as, during the time he was finishing it up, Robert May's wife was dying. May decided to keep working, probably as a sort of coping strategy, and he chose a reindeer, quote, because images of Santa's reindeer are already everywhere during the Christmas season, and his toddler daughter was obsessed with the deer at Lincoln Park Zoo, end quote. And so only a few short years after meeting Johnny Marks in 1939, May finished his 32-page illustrated booklet, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. The store, Montgomery Ward, distributed around 2.4 million copies that year. And one particularly neat side note, the story is written as a poem in anapestic tetrameter, aka the same meter as the 1823 poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, also known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. As we know, not too long after, Marks himself reinterpreted the song into music and went on to publish more than 150 other songs. In fact, Marks was referred to as the Mr. Christmas of the music world. This seems fair as he's also the creative behind the Burl Ives holiday standard Holly Jolly Christmas and Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, which Brenda Lee recorded at age 13, as I found out during research for this episode. After a while, plans for a Montgomery Ward tie-in campaign on TV are made. Rankin Bass, the animation studio behind most of the Christmas movies mentioned on our list, brought Rudolph to NBC's General Electric Fantasy Hour in 1964 to expand on the character's popularity. Rudolph's special was filmed in stop-motion animagic at Tadahito Mochinaga's MOM Productions in Tokyo, with the screenplay written by Romeo Mueller and all sound recordings, with supervision by Bernard Cohen, done at the RCA studios of Toronto. So though it started very much as a Chicago-based thing, this became an international production. Because Rankin Bass producers of the special, Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass, did not have a copy of the original Rudolph book, they worked off of the song as source material instead. creating an original story around the central narrative found therein. The Rudolph animated special scored massive ratings that kept it going well beyond its intended 2-year limit. Part of how they did this was through what was then cutting-edge technology, for example, using a red LED bulb for the very shiny nose. As it aired across those 2 years, a couple changes were made. For example, the initial credits did not show Santa picking up the misfit toys to bring to new homes and delivering them. Instead, it only showed him dropping wrapped presents off the sleigh to chimneys below. The revision was made after the story's initial broadcast due to a mass wave of viewer requests for a happy ending for the misfit toys. And with that change, almost everyone, with the exception being Robert May, got their happy endings. Rankin Bass went on to produce several more specials, including A Year Without Santa Claus. And fascinating side note on that one, Snow Miser and Heat Miser have been rumored to be respectively based on U.S. politicians Agnew and Nixon. Of course, our legendary songwriter was the biggest beneficiary here. Times Obituary noted that by the time Marks passed at age 71 in 1976, he had received royalties on more than 100 Red Nose products, as well as the song. That's because Montgomery Ward let him have the copyrights for the last 2 years of his life. Yet even back in 1958, the songwriter told the Associated Press, quote, "If I told you today how much money I made on Rudolph, my kids would be kidnapped tomorrow," end quote. And we can only imagine because by 1985, the song had sold 150 million records plus 8 million sheet copies worldwide, and bids have gone up to $10 million for the puppets used in the 1964 TV special. That was the highest number recorded when the puppets came up for sale last year. And moving right along, honeys, let's talk about Charlie Brown and his Christmas. The Coca-Cola Company decides to sponsor a tale about another misfit 1 year after Rudolph's success. This special was made in 6 months on a production budget of $96,000, going $20K over budget in the end, and the Charlie Brown special aired on December 9th, 1965 for the first time. So how it was made and by who? According to the official story, at least, producer Lee Mendelson got an unexpected call from an advertising agency, one McCann Erickson, about Coke wanting to sponsor an animated Christmas special. Because Mendelson had previously failed to convince this same agency to sponsor a Peanuts documentary, they called him first, and he assured McCann Erickson that the characters would be a perfect fit this time around. Mendelson would later state that he was interested in an animated Charlie Brown project after working on the film A Man Named Mays because while Willie Mays was arguably the best baseball player of all time, Charlie Brown's running gag, of course, in the strips is that he's one of the worst. So the producer felt that Brown was the natural follow-up subject to his previous work. Together, the Peanuts comic strip creator Charles Schulz, as well as Mendelson and animator Bill Melendez, worked fast to piece together a storyline. Schulz knew from the beginning he wanted to cut through the commercialism of the holiday and just bring the focus back to something a little deeper. But the team only had 6 months from start to finish to do that. In fact, the Charlie Brown special was completed only 10 days shy of its national broadcast premiere. As its fans know, what makes the Charlie Brown Christmas special so unusual is that it's so heartfelt and so clever, and the studio thought for these reasons, it was surely going to fail. But how did it get that way, exactly? The studio at first found the sound choices unusual to the point of off-putting. First, there was the atypical use of actual child actors and not adult ones. Schulz also refused to add a standard for animation at this time, laugh track, instead opting for the sincerity of the story to stand for itself. In another atypical choice, Mendelson brought in jazz musician Vince Guaraldi to compose a sophisticated soundtrack rather than relying on standard Christmas carols. The sole exception, of course, is a mostly hummed Hark the Herald Angels Sing at the end. Said Mendelson about this decision back in 2010, quote, "It gave it a contemporary sound that appealed to all ages. Although Vince had never scored anything else, and although I was basically a documentary filmmaker at the time, we started to work together on the cues because we both loved jazz and we both loved the piano," end quote. The biggest and scariest part of the special in the executive's eyes was Schulz's insistence on including the heart of the nativity story with explicit Bible verses during the pivotal climax scene. Our sources say that Schultz's faith stemmed from his Midwest background and religious and historical studies. Aspects of religion were a topic of study throughout his life. When Schultz first proposed the idea to Mendelssohn and Melendez, even they were hesitant because of the American social context, as well as the semi-unprecedented nature of this sort of inclusion. In the mid-20th century, Protestant Christianity had been the default in American culture for most of U.S. history, but society had grown somewhat more accommodating of Catholic and Jewish Americans in the years after World War II. Still, though, many major companies, major film and television executives felt unsure of how to handle exactly the shifting norms of 1960s especially, so they tended to avoid religious topics altogether. After Schultz came forward with his plan to them, CBS executives reportedly wrote back, quote, "The Bible thing scares us," end quote. Yet when they saw the proofs of the special, they had all run out of time to redo the entire dramatic arc, nor could they pull it after having done several advertisements for its arrival. So as it was about to premiere, CBS executives had very low hopes for the 25-minute special. They thought it was too slow, too serious, too different from the upbeat spectacles they imagined audiences wanted, only for half the country to tune in and watch it. From then on, as we know, it became a classic and it put the network in the holiday spirit. It also helped turn Peanuts from a popular comic strip into a multimedia empire, quote, "not because it was flashy or followed the rules, but because it was sincere," end quote. The special achieved success in two major commercial ways. First, that so many people tuned into it, and second, that the soundtrack sold 5 million copies in the US after its premiere. Yet it also had unexpected commercial impacts. Charlie Brown's scraggly little tree was inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Fir Tree, yet it had a very real impact on the fad of the aluminum tree, popular at the time of the special, which was no longer being regularly manufactured by 1967. Apparently, a lot of people took to heart the character's insistence on purchasing a real tree and disparagement of the aluminum versions. The Charlie Brown Christmas special went on to win both an Emmy and a Peabody Award and was voted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2007. It has also been added to the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry list of, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically important, end quote, American sound recordings as of 2012. And last but certainly not least, honeys, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. It must be said, honeys, that this special owes its success to the changes in attitude caused by the Charlie Brown special. The original animated Grinch first premiered December 18th of 1966 on CBS as a TV division of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, who wanted another holiday cartoon special and decided to adapt the Dr. Seuss book. After making that decision, they needed a sponsor, and they went to various presentations, finally finding the Foundation for Full Service Banks, who provided the production funding. And it was no small amount of funding. It would total over $2,676,000 in today's money. I guess it's a good thing they were feeling generous. At first, Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, was worried about animation and adaptation, but Chuck Jones, the famous animator, won him over. MGM also made assurances to Geisel about not limiting the quality on its animation, which carefully followed the 16 rules, or the guidelines of good animation, that Chuck Jones applied to most of his films. One rule, which makes a big difference here, is that most of the fully animated characters have implied skeletal structures as well as muscle movements in order to maximize their realness. And for 1960s animation, it is pretty real. In the end, approximately 15,000 drawings and cells, 250 background drawings, 4,500 dispensable and unusable character layout drawings, and 1,200 character layout drawings that were usable were created for the special. Jones worked on more than 1,500 sketches himself to bring the characters to life and changed their physical appearances, although their personalities remained the same from book to animation. For the final animated all-together special, we can thank animators Ken Harris, Abe Levitow, Ben Washam, and Dick Thompson. How the Grinch Stole Christmas is another case where the music is a little different from what we saw in the past. Geisel himself, Dr. Seuss, was convinced that he should write the music for The Grinch by one Albert Hague. Haig was originally born as Albert Marcuse in Berlin in 1920, but he escaped to Rome with his mother in 1937, then got help from family members to attend the College of Music in Cincinnati on a scholarship. He played both boogie-woogie music in nightclubs and classic piano concerts while there, including a performance with the acclaimed Russian pianist and composer Sergei Rachmaninoff. Haig eventually found his success composing for Broadway shows. One of his most popular songs, Young and Foolish, from the 1955 musical Plain and Fancy, has been recorded by Dean Martin, Bing Crosby, and Tony Bennett. The score for the Grinch special consists of 60 musicians playing a 34-piece orchestra with a 12-voice choir. They all worked for a total of 8 hours on the 3 songs titled Trim Up the Tree, which is the polka-style one with the noise, noise, noise quote. There's also Welcome Christmas and Your Mean One, Mr. Grinch. But the idea for the so-called Seussian Latin, aka Fahu Fores Dahu Dores, came from Chuck Jones to solve the issue of making a different kind of Christmas special and making unique Christmas music. We then had Boris Karloff and Thurl Ravenscroft lend their iconic voices, although it cost the studio a bit more than they expected. For many years, Thurl Ravenscroft, also the voice of Tony the Tiger, went uncredited on You're a Mean One. This despite the efforts of Seuss, who shortly after the release called the actor to apologize for this oversight and later wrote letters to columnists nationwide to credit Ravenscroft with the song. Karloff, especially as a longtime Dr. Seuss fan, was eager to do the special. And after the recording, the sound engineers removed Karloff's higher pitches to create the gravelly grunt of the Grinch's voice. And in the end, after it aired, the hearts of viewers did grow 3 sizes, or at least felt a little bit warmer. And as we know, Grinch was a huge commercial success, a win for everyone involved. It has spawned 2 other movie versions, and the Grinch story, quotes, and characters are still referenced, remade, sung about, and more today. As it's one of my personal favorites, I am not too mad that the Grinch is inescapable around Christmas time. And that has been our special, honeys. I hope you are staying warm with some hot cocoa or hot toddies or whatever your hot drink of choice is. Remember to leave your carrots out for the reindeer and stay safe. Hope you're resting and having a great break filled with love and family and fun. We'll see you again in the new year. And until then, take care of yourselves, honeys. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.